During the Syrian civil war, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, proved to be a powerful player. They controlled vast areas of land in the northeast of the country, maintained strong international relations. They were well armed, had a comprehensive political structure working on the ground, and just about managed to maintain services for civilians. When the Assad regime fell and the interim government of Ahmed al-Sharaa took control, the question of what would happen to the Syrian Democratic Forces loomed heavy over the country. Would they put their trust in al-Sharaa or continue their struggle for self-determination? The answer was quickly answered when violence broke out between the new interim government and the SDF. For almost a year, there were numerous failed diplomatic efforts and relentless low-level skirmishes between the two groups. In January, it appeared as if the al-Sharaa government had had enough and launched a major and decisive attack. After battles in and around Aleppo, the SDF withdrew, and on January 30th announced that they had agreed to be integrated into the Syrian army. On February 1st, Katiba Idilbi from the Syrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates set out the terms of this agreement and what it meant to be part of al-Sharaa's new centralised Syria. He said, "We have given the SDF leadership a deadline to demonstrate in practice that all armed groups will comply with this agreement and the integration process. Once integration is completed, any armed or undisciplined groups that refuse to adhere to the agreement will be treated as outlaw groups." This week, why did the SDF agree to integrate? What does it mean for the Kurdish cause of self-determination? And what do recent events tell us about the Syria that al-Sharaa's government is building? My name is Hugo Goodridge, and you're listening to The New Arab Voice. When the brutal Assad regime fell, there were jubilations across the country. But after the parties, the Syrian Democratic Forces were left controlling a large area of the northeast of the country and asking the question, what about us?
I think that the first phase of the transition, especially after the fall of Assad, did not center on the SDF at all.
This is Rahaf Al-Dugli, Senior Editor at Cogent Social Sciences and Fellow at the Arab Reform Initiative.
We have witnessed that the new authorities prioritized a national dialogue conference and a constitutional declaration, both of which were presented as foundational moments in post-Assad order. However, these processes were brief, elite-driven, and did not include meaningfully SDF.
The Syrian Democratic Forces were formed in 2015. To simplify things, we can say that it brought together a handful of Kurdish-led armed groups who had been fighting in opposition to the Assad regime into a single unified force. This created a formidable army, but also solidified control over the northeastern corner of Syria, which included Kurdish majority areas, but also Arab areas, where the SDF had control with support from the Arab tribes. This was governed as the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria. Both the SDF and the governing Autonomous Administration were Kurdish-led. During the Syrian civil war, the SDF were engaged in fighting against the Assad regime and its supporters, but they were not a military force driving the army towards Damascus. Their main occupation was maintaining the borders that they had set and defending against attacks, mainly from Turkey, and armed groups supported and armed by Turkey, mainly a group going by the name of the Syrian National Army, or SNA. Additionally, they also played a vital role in the international effort to eliminate ISIS. And when the Assad regime fell, the SDF and the political leadership of the Kurds were important players in the country. And yet, all the spoils went to al-Sharaa. Months after the victory at al-Sharaa, the status of the SDF remained unclear.
Suddenly, on the 10th of March, we see both President al-Sharaa and General Mazloum Abdi signing a more of a military and security deal about how SDF would integrate. My first concern back then was that negotiations with armed groups should not be only centered on security and military, but rather should be expanded to include political questions, especially when SDF for so long has been saying that they are fighting for more Kurdish rights and for political settlements more than military settlements.
On paper, the deal, while not perfect, would go a good way to settle the status of the SDF. The March 10th deal said the SDF would integrate, and the running of the northeast would be handed over to the interim government. But ultimately, time proved that the deal was not good enough. Talks continued nominally, as did skirmishes between the interim government forces and the SDF.
I have often heard from SDF that there is technical problems. In overall this last year, we met the Syrian government only 5 times. We didn't have kind of enough consultations with the authorities to integrate the SDF into the MOD and MOI.
That's the Ministry of Defence and the Ministry of the Interior.
And also from the government side, they were saying and accusing SDF of buying times, especially after the violence in Suwaida and on the coast, that the SDF was more of buying time until maybe the regional and the international opinion towards the authorities in Damascus might change. And I think both parties, they were not trusting each other, and that's immediately fed into my first concern that this is more of an elite bargaining rather than where civil society organizations and civilian oversights and other kind of civilian organization could have played a more important role in these negotiations to at least kind of make it less hardened positions, whether from the SDF or the government.
The disagreements between the two parties were fundamental.
Both parties are coming from a completely different positioning. The central government in Damascus was calling for a more unified and central government, whereas SDF were calling for power sharing, decentralization, and they were citing that the government has not protected Kurdish rights. So for a year, the SDF was strong in using that political narrative that we are fighting for the Kurds to get more rights. So the SDF has became more of a guarantor for Kurdish rights.
At the beginning of October 2025, tensions rose dramatically around the areas of Sheikh Maqsoud and Ashrafiyah, 2 areas of Aleppo city with a Kurdish majority. The Syrian army constructed earthen barriers, blocking roads on the outskirts of the areas and establishing positions inside residential buildings. Protests against the barriers were met with tear gas and live rounds. Kurds accused the Syrian army of violating the deal of March 10th. These tensions then spilt over into violence, with small and medium arms being used. Both sides accused the other of targeting civilians. On October 7th, SDF General Commander Mazloum Abdi and co-chair of the Department of Foreign Relations Ilham Ahmed met with al-Sharaa in the capital Damascus, and the violence was halted in these areas. While only lasting 2 days, the fighting killed 3 and injured over 26. As the months continued, with no solid plan in place, violent clashes continued across the country, including, again, in Aleppo.
So at the beginning of 2026, there were ongoing negotiations between the Syrian transition government led by interim President Ahmed al-Sharaa and the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces led by Mazloum Abdi, with the participation of the US.
This is Joseph Daher. Joseph is a Syrian academic and specialist on the political economy of the Middle East.
These negotiations ended unsuccessfully, and a few days later on, a military offensive led by armed forces affiliated with Damascus, the Syrian army, led a military operation to take back control of the Kurdish majority inhabited areas of Ashrafiyah and Sheikh Maqsoud in Aleppo.
Once again, violence returned to Aleppo. And while it didn't last long, it was intense, with tanks, artillery, and suicide attacks all being used in the fighting.
The military confrontation lasted for a few days until the total control by the Syrian transition government armed forces, which led to the displacement of tens of thousands of civilians from Sheikh Maqsoud and Ashrafiyah.
One resident of Ashrafiyah described the fighting to a reporter.
I fled
my home in Ashrafiyah on the first roundabout. The situation is really difficult. It's hard to describe. We fled at the last second. We've been through a lot. There's a lot of bombing. My family's exhausted. Only God knows how we got out. And the snipers were firing the whole time. During this round of fighting, the Syrian army delivered a much more decisive blow to the SDF fighters and forced the Kurdish fighters out. As they retreated back to the northeast of the country, they lost more territory.
SDF, in the process of these military confrontation, lost many of its territories, and the Sharaa succeeded in infiltrating SDF internally, where also we know the tribes who were part of SDF withdrew and took the government side.
These tribes are located in the largely Arab provinces of Raqqa and Deir el-Zor. These areas accounted for approximately 80% of the territory controlled by the SDF. Their defection to the government in late January 2026 forced Kurdish fighters to retreat further into the northeast, as far as Kobani, Kamishli and Hasaka, where the country's largest population of Kurds reside. The violence that was seen in Aleppo was both a continuation of the violence between the Syrian interim government forces and the SDF, and an escalation. But why did it escalate when it did?
I think it's broken because al-Sharaa also, from the governmental sources, is saying that this is skirmishes that happened over the last year, that SDF has not made any progress or in terms of integrating the Asayish in the MOI. In Aleppo, and they cannot accept armed groups to be active in Aleppo. So both parties, as I said, that they don't seem that there is trust building that's enough for them to stop fighting. And I think now it's more about al-Sharaa wanted to send a message to the international community that SDF is not as powerful as they seem to say. And also there was a green light from the US to say that we are rather have our primary relations with the Sharaa rather than the SDF, and that SDF was built or established at a time where there was no central government in Syria.
There was probably no one point that caused the escalation. Month after month there had been blame and counterblame, with both sides accusing the other of failing to adhere to the March 10th deal, and both sides believing that they had the strength to hold out for the best possible terms in a deal. In the end, the SDF simply couldn't hold out any longer. They couldn't hold Sheikh Maqsoud or Ashrafiyah, and with the loss of support of the Arab tribes, they couldn't hold Raqqa or Deir el-Zor. By January 30th, there was only one thing left to do: agree to a deal, which is what they did.
So the Syrian Democratic Forces accepted the latest deal on the 30th of January, put forward by the Syrian transition government, I believe for the following reasons. First of all, they suffered a major defeat, whether politically and militarily, in front of the Syrian transition government. They lost a lot of territories, especially Arab majority held areas where they were not able throughout the years to win the consent and even, I would say, the popularity of Arab majority population in these areas, whether Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, because basically the local population did not have real representation in the institutions, mostly superficial, while there were forms of discrimination and security, campaigns targeting our majority inhabited areas population, which created feeling of frustrations among local population.
Given the lack of popularity of the SDF in Arab areas, it probably shouldn't have come as a surprise when the tribes left them. But the Arab tribes weren't the only supporter that the SDF lost. Over the months, they've also lost the support of the United States.
And secondly, we've seen that I think SDF understood that today the major allies of the US are not anymore the SDF, but the Damascus central authorities. Ahmed al-Sharaa' first objective since arriving to power was to gain international legitimacy, which in many ways he has been successful. First Gulf monarchies and then the US. The US at the end of 2025 lifted the Caesar sanction. It hosted Ahmed al-Sharaa at the White House. It was quite clear that the latest military offensive led by the Syrian transition government would not have been possible without the green light provided by the US against the SDF.
Rahaf al-Dugli.
The guarantor here, which is the US, is responsible for this kind of break of violence between the two parties. What we see from previous post-conflict scenarios where the guarantor should have more of a neutral position between parties. And I think the US did not send a clear, transparent message to SDF from early on. Since the 10th of March agreement, I think even the US was not, they had a clear plan regarding withdrawing from Syria, but they were testing the waters on the capabilities of al-Sharaa forces to fight or combat ISIS. So I think that the kind of more of a lack of transparent communication from the US to SDF played a part where the SDF felt that they still have leverage to maneuver or to stay as they are, to have the back of the US. That explains why the SDF suddenly felt that they are betrayed by the US guarantor. They don't seem to understand or to comprehend the current regional dynamics, that especially in times where Trump is calling for a US military action against Iran.
While losing allies, they were also facing older adversaries, Turkey, who view the SDF as effectively an extension of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, who Turkey have been at war with for decades. It was reported that Turkey was providing logistical support to the forces of the Syrian interim government during the battles in Aleppo. And in truth, Turkish forces had previously only been prevented from attacking the northeast because of the US. Looking at the Syrian interim government and the SDF, you can see that the odds favoured the interim government. The SDF were facing a larger force, one that had much greater levels of support, if not from all of the country, then a significant handful of important foreign powers. Additionally, as well as fighting the interim government, the SDF were also fighting amongst themselves.
I would cite one internal source that's very close to Mazloum Abdi, saying that Mazloum Abdi is facing the same kind of complexities that al-Sharaa is facing now internally with his core group, that also Mazloum Abdi is challenging some of radicals inside SDF itself. So it seems that both military leaders, if we look at al-Sharaa, how that he is also combating some of the radical groups within his forces, we see that Mazloum Abdi is also facing more of radical PKK sentiments in his forces. Some of these that are not accepting any concessions to Turkey or any concessions to al-Sharaa, and they are more of wanting an autonomous consolidation in these areas. So it seems that Mazloum Abdi is the mostly soft or flexible leader in the SDF.
As we said, following their defeat in Aleppo and the loss in support of the Arab tribes, the SDF retreated back to their territories in the northeast and agreed to make a deal. So what's in the deal?
According to the statement made relating to the 30th of January agreement between the SDF and Damascus, SDF forces will progressively be integrated within the Syrian army on the forms of officially 4 brigades, 3 brigades for the northeast and 1 additional brigade for the city of Kobani that will be connected to the Aleppo governorate. There will also be an integration of civilian administration, of the autonomous administration within the state authorities. In addition to this, there are other points in the agreement relating to the entry of symbolic numbers of security forces of Damascus within the major cities controlled until today by the SDF, such as Hasakeh, Qamishli.
The deal agreed on January 30th is more than a little similar to the deal announced on March 10th. That deal provided for SDF-controlled civilian and military institutions in northeast Syria to be integrated within the state. This deal is for a phased integration of Kurdish military forces into the Syrian army and the integration of Kurdish civil institutions into state structures. The difference this time is the weaker state of the SDF and the stronger position of the interim government. The theme of al-Sharaa's Syria is centralization and consolidation. In May of 2025, he addressed the nation and said, Syria will no longer be an arena for the struggle for influence, nor a platform for foreign ambitions. We will not allow the division of Syria, and we will not make room for reviving the narratives of the former regime to fragment our people. The interim government have made it clear. Control, power, and military strength will only lie with the leaders in Damascus. There is no tolerance for armed groups. You cannot go alone. If you cannot work with or for Damascus, then you don't work in this new Syria. Over the past year, the SDF have been shown what this means, and they decided to ultimately make a deal. That does not mean that the deal is done and dusted. There are still serious questions about how this deal will be implemented.
This said, a lot of questions remain regarding the implementation of this deal, especially relating to establishment of 3 brigades, 4 brigades, 4 Kurdish brigades within the Syrian army. How will this integration occur, especially relating to the relations with the former groups of the Syrian National Army, which acted for years as a Turkish proxy. You have people sanctioned for crimes committed against Kurdish civilians, Kurdish political personalities.
While opposition groups fought against the Assad regime, they also fought against each other. With the SDF now set to be integrated, they will become part of a military that includes members of former groups who have committed crimes against Syrian Kurds, and vice versa. SDF soldiers also committed crimes against Syrian Arab communities.
Similarly, how the integration of civilian administration will occur in the Syrian state is also a big question mark, especially that the Damascus ruling authorities have made several statements that they want to diminish the number of state deployments in the structure of the state, or etc. So a lot of questions remain. There is still persistent, I would say, tensions among local populations because of the violation of human rights that have been committed.
And there are yet more questions.
And finally, the last and I believe key point is what kind of political participation. And here, it's not a question only restricted to the Kurdish issue, but more widely within Syrian society. Despite acceptance and recognition of important Kurdish national rights, the question remains what kind of political participation within the Damascus central authorities that have, since the beginning of their arrival to power, seek to consolidate their power and centralize power within Damascus. And I think the latest offensive against the SDF must be seen as well in this ongoing pursuit to centralize and consolidate power within the hand of the new ruling authorities in Damascus.
Throughout the year of negotiations, a key narrative for the SDF was to present themselves as the sole guarantor of Kurdish rights. On January 16th, as the violence in Aleppo was unfolding, President al-Sharaa made an effort to counter this narrative and address the Kurdish issue more widely in Syrian society when he announced Decree 13. In a televised speech, he said, "Today I am honoured to issue a special decree to our Kurdish people that guarantee their rights and particularities under the law. I also urge everyone who was forced to leave their land to return safely and securely without any condition or restriction other than laying down their arms."
While we can obviously recognize the historical achievement of recognizing the fact of Kurdish language as part of the Syrian social fabric, recognizing Eid al-Nowruz as part, again, of Syrian heritage, history, similarly providing citizenship to the Kurds that were prevented of their nationality for decades are important step forward. However, this occurred in a period, as we were mentioning, of a military offensive led by the Syrian army against the Syrian Democratic Forces, in which we witness acts of violence, racist slurs, practices against Kurdish populations. There are still information coming out of assassinations of civilians. This decree, in many ways, was not saluted by the vast majority of the Kurdish population because they were being threatened by a military offensive of Damascus.
A decree of this nature was needed and desired, but it also feels hollow when announced by the same individual who is also ordering troops into Kurdish neighborhoods.
However, that national decree came very late when there was military confrontation with the SDF. So while that national decree was important for the Kurds and strengthened the state's narrative that it's the only guarantor for all Syrian communities regarding their rights and political representation, it came at a time when SDF was completely at the like more of having that break of violence with the governments. So SDF still has, in terms of like representing certain Kurdish communities in al-Hasaka, Kobani, and in Kamishli, but they cannot speak for all the Kurds in Syria, because as I said, these Kurds in Syria, they have different grievances, they have different experiences, and they never were anyway in communication or in contact or under the authority of SDF before. So SDF might still have some social representation in other areas, for example, as in al-Hasaka or Kamishli and in Kobani, but not in other areas. But for political integration and military integration, this should have been in parallel. This should have been facilitated in parallel with over the 12 months negotiation with SDF.
This is an important point. The SDF are Kurdish-led forces. They controlled the Kurdish majority cities of Pasaké, Qamishli, and Kobani. But they are not all Kurds in Syria, and do not represent all Kurds in Syria. Decree 13 was an important step for Kurds, although it's far from ideal that it occurred at a time when violence was being committed against the Kurds. At the same time, members of the interim government were also inciting violence against Kurds.
You had a religious decree mentioning from the Minister of Awqaf, of Religious Endowment, stating its support for the military offensive of the Syrian Arab Army and mentioning the Surat of the Quran, Al-Anfal, which for all Kurds have clear bad memories, as it mentioned the military campaign led by the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein in the 80s against the Kurds, where chemical weapons were used.
On February 3rd, interim government forces entered the Kurdish majority city of Qamishli. Riding on government vehicles, soldiers flashed peace signs, but apprehension remains among the population. One resident told a reporter, "We don't trust them. They have a bad track record, as they did in Sueda, Dara and elsewhere, where they committed massacres. We fear the same might happen here as well. We had ceasefires, but despite that, they continue to launch attacks against us." There is another problem with Decree 13.
While it's a presidential decree, it still needs to go through a legal and democratic and constitutional process. Indeed, there are various flaws with this presidential decree. First of all, this constitution is temporary, therefore presidential responsibilities as well. This has not been included in the constitution, and it goes against some articles of the constitution. There's still no parliament to validate such a decision. So on a legal democratic process, yes, there are some questions can be raised.
Effectively, what the president can give, he can take away. And the decree, however good it might be, does lack legal and constitutional permanence. The collapse of the SDF will put an end to the hopes that once existed that they might be able to create an autonomous region for Kurds in Syria. During the Syrian civil war, the biggest backer of the SDF was the United States. The US were not really fully committed to this ambition of an autonomous administration, but the US was an important strategic partner for the SDF. Hand in hand, together, they fought the Islamic State terror group.
What the SDF narrative now is that we fought ISIS for so long. We were the ones that protected the world or saved the world from ISIS. And we feel betrayed by the US position and the European position for sacrificing us, especially after the Palmyra incident, that where we know that 2 American commanders were killed at the hands of a security officer that was affiliated with the Sharia forces. And it seems that they are citing this incident to say that you cannot trust Sharia capability to fight ISIS, and also they are more of saying that this is more of a regional and international deal between al-Sharaa and the US to fight Shia militias on the Iraqi border. So they feel that they have been sacrificed by this kind of agreement, very hierarchical, top elite agreement between al-Sharaa and the US. The US has made its decision on who is ready to fight Iranian presence in Iraq or on the Syrian Iraqi borders. And it seems that al-Sharaa is the party that's the only one that's capable of that.
With the collapse of the Assad regime, the SDF's priorities changed. But the priorities of the US remained. They are still concerned about ISIS and still want boots on the ground that can conduct operations on behalf of the US. Also to help, if needed, with any fight against Iranian assets. The interim Syrian government has said they will do that.
And also, this is one from the my internal sources within SDF, that Mazloum Abdi it was told to him that, are you capable of fighting Shia militias on the Syrian-Iraqi border? And he said, no, we are more interested in protecting our areas within Syria. So the SDF sources seems to say that Mazloum Abdi could not be part of this regional and international deal, whereas al-Sharaa was capable of that, and that's why we were sacrificed.
There are still huge questions around the SDF's integration into the Syrian army and how the interim government will absorb and take over state responsibilities in the northeast. And there are other, more fundamental problems. In a speech to the nation at the end of January 2025, shortly after taking control, Ahmed al-Sharaa declared himself not to be a ruler, but, quote, as a servant for our wounded homeland. He announced his intention to, quote, realise Syria's unity and renaissance. He said the political process, quote, requires true participation by all Syrian men and women inside and outside the country so that we can build their future with freedom and dignity without marginalisation or sidelining. 1 year on from that speech, these promises have not materialised. Power and responsibility is not being spread. It appears to be shrinking to a point. The integration of the SDF can be achieved. If the interim government is willing, then the questions that remain can likely be answered. It's a tragedy that so much violence was needed to get to this point. But the Kurds in Syria are not simply a military group. They are a people and a culture with a rich history. They, like all minority groups in Syria, need to be given a voice in this new country. Not just a gun and a new uniform. Final words to Joseph Daher.
I believe that you can build unity, or let's say social or national cohesion among society by accepting diversity, but you will definitely not reach a form of stability when it comes to social national cohesion when you impose your rule in areas that clearly reject you and are only asking for political participation in the decision-making process. And I think the main problem of this government has been its rejection of any kind of participation from below of different sectors of the society. And this is not restricted only to religious or ethnic minorities, but to the whole of the Syrian society. We haven't seen any forms of elections, whether in province or governorates or even in trade unions, professional association. We've seen appointment from personalities close to the ruling center and more based on loyalty. So I think this is the key problem in creating instability among society and creating divisions. Definitely this new power inherited a political situation characterized by division among the society, by geographical and political fragmentation. But unfortunately, rather than tackling this political and geographical fragmentation, it has deepened the fragmentation within the Syrian society. And this is something very much worrying. So despite, definitely important cultural recognition regarding, rights of minorities and or regarding the Kurds, which again needs to be, saluted, this stops when it comes to political participation. And this is, I think, a key problem for the future of Syria. And again, that is not only connected or restricted to religious minorities, but for the whole Syrian society.
This episode of The New Arab Voice was written and produced by me, Hugo Goodridge. Our theme music was by Omar Al-Fil. The New Arab Voice will be back with a new episode shortly. Don't forget to subscribe to get notified when a new episode drops. You can find the links in the show notes. Until then, you can find all our previous episodes on all major podcast platforms. You can check out our social media accounts on Instagram and X, both at TNA Podcasts, for additional content. And you can email us, podcast@newarab.com. You can subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and you can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Don't forget to follow The New Arab on Facebook, X and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region.